Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
After the divorce, her ex-husband rushed into his former wife's new luxurious house with the intention of settling there. If only he knew. Maria was looking at the middle-aged man sitting in front of her. "So your dream has come true, you bought a house," he said, glancing around and smiling uncertainly. "Well, I'm very happy for you. It's very good and right. You always deserve the best. The house is truly wonderful, exactly the one we once dreamed of, remember?" Maria sighed lightly. It was very funny because he sits in front of her, pretending that they still have something in common, like shared dreams or memories. Yes, this man was her husband not long ago, whom she loved. At least it seemed that she was ready to do anything for him. And now she looks at him, and he only evokes a feeling of disgust in her. Just think, a few years ago he literally made her blind, and she really almost completely overlooked the most important thing in her life. "Thomas, why did you come?" she asked the main question. "Well, how?" he hesitated. "I just found out that now you have. What I inherited and bought a house is clear," she helped him. "And you came to see and, so to speak, evaluate the purchase and your prospects of returning, right? Why are you like that, Maria?" He took off his glasses and nervously wiped them. "I just thought, it seems to me that we broke up somehow stupidly, hastily, without thinking everything through, and now maybe we could not." She decided to end this ridiculous, pointless, completely unnecessary conversation for her. "There is no we, Thomas, and never was. I perfectly understand why you suddenly decided to return because you found out about this house. So, you could get into this house as, well, for example, a gardener, but it's too hard and disgusting for me to see you. Go away and never come back here again." Walking the man away and loudly slamming the gate behind him, Maria poured herself some coffee, looked thoughtfully at him, and placed the mug on the table. Then she took a bottle of white wine from the refrigerator, poured it into a beautiful glass, and with pleasure took a big, cool, and tart sip. That's how a day should end for the owner of a country house, she thought, and this thought brought a smile to her face. After all, how many times had she seen in movies and series about the good life how a woman in a pristine linen dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat with ribbons, necessarily in white and blue stripes, with a glass in hand, steps out onto a sunlit and sun-warmed terrace and sinks into a chair. Then, with a slow, lazy gesture, she must adjust her sunglasses on her face, although it's not quite clear why they are needed at all when there is a hat with brims. And look toward the sparkling surface of the pool, pondering whether to swim now or postpone the pleasant activity until later. Maria, fully in line with her notions of the good life, stepped onto the terrace, having first taken off her slippers and delightfully feeling the slightly rough surface beneath her bare feet. Everything she saw before her still amazed her and even caused some doubts about its reality. An emerald lawn stretched between the house and the large planters overflowing with lush hydrangeas of all colors. Tall trees with dense canopies, behind which the roof of a gazebo was visible. And a white stone parapet along the small embankment, which sloped sharply down to the river. The sun, leaning towards the sunset, bathed everything around in a soft golden light, illuminating the glass, water, stone, flowers, and tree canopies in all shades of the rainbow. It was so beautiful around that Maria involuntarily sighed and shook her head in disbelief. All of this was somehow too beautiful, too perfect, for her to finally stop doubting its reality. "You, Maria, are just a foolish, self-conscious woman," she said aloud. "One must get used to good things." She laughed joyfully, looked around, and suddenly realized what exactly she was missing. Every happy homeowner simply must have an equally happy partner. But seriously, she just terribly wanted the person to be by her side right now, the very person with whom she had long, as it turned out, wanted to share everything. Both the house and the pool, the air bathed in the evening sun, and the whole world. And most importantly, her entire life, however much time she had left. He had been by her side all her life, her knight, her guardian angel, using very unangelic words. He was with her in sorrow and joy, without making any vows or promises. Only these were her sorrows and joys. And now she wants to share all of this with him. And she wished that only the joyful moments had to be shared. My dear, my only, faithful, the very best, come, I am waiting for you very much, she said into the phone receiver and closed her eyes, fearing that the immodestly eyeing bird perched on the railing might overhear her secret. Maria grew up in a family that was hard to even call a family. After all, family is supposed to be about togetherness, but how could there be 7 members when she and her mother were almost always alone together? Although, in reality, Maria had a grandmother, Agatha, who, however, did not like to visit them much and preferred that her granddaughter come to her instead. The relationship between her mother and grandmother was not particularly warm, but while Maria was little, she didn't care about it. Grandma was kind and generous, as a grandmother should be. As she grew up, Maria learned that she had a couple more elderly relatives, as her mother ironically called them. These were Maria's father's parents, with whom her mother, and therefore Maria herself, did not communicate. The girl regretted this fact, rightly believing that the more grandmothers and grandfathers a child has, the more gifts he or she receives for New Year and birthdays. Regarding the reasons for her mother's lack of communication with relatives, albeit distant ones, Grandma Agatha expressed herself amusingly, but incomprehensibly. And, of course, Maria had a father, or rather, a so-called father, as her mother always called him. Probably thanks to her mother, Maria did not feel particularly tender feelings towards her father. Her parents separated when the girl was 2 years old. Their story was short-lived, uncheerful, and banal. Ida and Antonio studied together at university, and at some point, the guy decided that the gray-eyed girl, who was famous throughout the course for her excellent lecture notes, interested him more than the other girls around. Ida had nothing against Antonio, a nice guy, not particularly talented, but neither the worst in studies nor in student activities. Youth, bubbling in her blood, a desire for the opposite sex, and a complete unwillingness to think about what would come next led to a result that was as unexpected as it was inevitable. In short, at the very end of their studies in the 5th year, Ida became pregnant. The bewildered young people weathered a real storm of disapproval, first from Antonio's parents and then from Ida's mother, who was angry at her unreasonable daughter for being alone, especially since Ida's father had, unfortunately, passed away by that time. After long and turbulent debates, the only right decision from everyone's perspective was made: to give birth. Antonio bravely dove into defending his diploma and searching for a job to support his small family, which was about to grow with a new member. Ida, frightened and subdued, was literally crushed by the events and had almost no opinion of her own on the matter. She received her diploma from the dean's hands, who couldn't help but glance at her now rounded and visible belly, and married Antonio Moya. She couldn't even understand how all this happened in her life. It was as if she was being carried by a current she clearly couldn't handle. However, Antonio's decent behavior, his caring words and actions, and most importantly, the preparations for the wedding, gave her some optimism. After all, she was inevitably becoming an adult, a married, financially stable lady, and this situation demanded it. Moreover, everything related to weddings invariably brings a surge of enthusiasm and joy, captivating her with the entire whirlwind of joyful preparations, beautiful purchases, and anxiously happy expectations. At least, that's what the future bride thought. But reality turned out to be quite different. Everything was simpler, more prosaic, cheaper, and seemed to utterly destroy any desire to hope for something in the future. There was neither a dress with an enormous skirt and a long train that she had dreamed of since she was 3, nor white doves that she and her chosen one were supposed to release into the sky with happy faces, nor envious eyes of her friends, nor a cake as tall as herself, nor a car with an open roof from which she, unbearably beautiful, would send everyone air kisses while departing on her honeymoon. In short, there was none of what she had dreamed and fantasized about for many years. Their so-called wedding was celebrated in a small, very modest cafe owned by some of her mother's friends and resembled more the birthday of a relative than an event that even remotely reminded her of a wedding ceremony as she understood it. The bride herself was dressed in an outfit that deserved, at most, a place at some village wedding, especially if a woman was not getting married for the first time and absolutely didn't care what she was wearing. Of course, Ida wasn't entirely objective. In her modest but stylish dress, she looked wonderful, and Antonio looked at her with warm, affectionate eyes, clearly proud of his wife. The guests cheerfully and sincerely shouted, gladly drank and ate, and then excitedly ran around the chairs, pretending to be musical instruments, and popped inflatable balloons with different parts of their bodies. In general, they happily did everything that usually intoxicated guests are made to do at weddings by equally tipsy hosts. With the combined efforts of their relatives, primarily Antonio's parents, the young couple was allocated a small but cozy apartment where the young family, expecting a new member, began to build their life. In due time, Ida gave birth to a girl named Maria. Motherhood overwhelmed the young mother with a deluge of swaddling, feeding, bathing, almost sleepless nights, and a strict diet that, to her annoyance, consisted of Ida's most hated foods. Antonio, rejoicing at the arrival of their daughter, acted completely shamelessly from Ida's perspective, slacking off from home under the pretense of needing to earn money, and left her alone with all the problems, and most importantly, alone with a crying baby for no apparent reason. "Mom, I don't know, everything is somehow hard for me, in general," confessed their daughter, stammering and blushing shyly. "Well, what did you expect? It's a child after all," the woman shrugged. "It's difficult even for a mature, independent woman, and you are still essentially a child yourself. It's even harder for you. But it's okay, it will all pass, and only the good will remain." "And where will the good come from?" Ida asked sullenly. "You'll earn it, no doubt about it," declared her mother. "As for your life, you know, Ida, you created this life for yourself, no one forced you." "Well, of course. Go ahead and say that I should have used my head instead of just one part," the young mother snapped, not receiving the support from her own mother that she had greatly hoped for. "Well, you could say that," nodded Ida's mother. "It's pleasing that you understand this. Sweetheart, believe me, everything will be fine." Nevertheless, the woman decided to end the conversation on a positive note. "The main thing is that you and Antonio have a family, you have Maria, your girl, and everything else is nonsense." Unfortunately, that very everything else turned out not to be such nonsense. Ida constantly felt tired, sick, and broken. The girl slept poorly, cried constantly, and it turned out that, apparently, motherly duties did not free her from her duties as a wife. So what, I should also, on top of all this, also wash, clean, cook. Am I not supposed to go weed in your garden? Well, let's say you aren't washing in an ice hole, thank God. We'll manage the garden somehow ourselves, and you never really bothered much with cleaning, laughed the mother. And as for cooking, I see you aren't putting in much effort. At the same time, she threw a meaningful glance at her son-in-law, who tried to hide a packet of instant noodles behind his back while chewing on a sandwich. Antonio was honestly trying, so to speak, to smooth things over. He cooked food himself whenever he had a little time, washed his socks and shirts, which unfortunately were needed every day due to the strict dress code at work. And also Maria's diapers and pantsuits. He walked with the little one in the evenings, peacefully snoozing in the stroller. He even bathed the girl, at first until he had cramps, straining with fear, but gradually more confidently. But despite the heroic efforts of the young father, the situation in the apartment and in the family only worsened. They never truly became close and necessary people for each other, never developed tenderness and care for one another. Obviously, there was simply never any real feeling between them. By chance, they ended up together, first at the student desk, then at parties, and later in an apartment. Together, truly, they never were. The miracle when the birth of a child brings people closer, giving them that true soul unity they might have been missing before, did not happen with Ida and Antonio, unfortunately. Their relationship became increasingly strained, with arguments becoming more frequent, louder, and more pointless. Finally, when Maria turned 2 years old, they made perhaps the only truly joint decision in their entire family life, to divorce. Antonio left Ida with their daughter and, gathering his few belongings, departed. "Let him go, we'll live without him, no big deal." Ida shouted at her mother. "You're to blame for all this too." "Me?" Agatha was genuinely surprised. If you were a normal mother, you would have made me get rid of the pregnancy." "Oh, Lord." "At least choose your words in front of your daughter," the woman said, lowering her voice and shaking her head. Ida did not like the role of the treacherously abandoned wife and lonely mother. She enthusiastically told anyone who would listen about the deceitful nature and treachery of men in general, and one particular man in particular shared the unbearable difficulties of raising a child alone, and for some reason found pleasure in all of this. She openly shared her thoughts on these matters with her daughter, not hesitating in her expressions. The girl did not understand most of what was said, but she firmly learned one thing: her father was a bad person, and even if he does something good, it's not from the heart, but because he knows he's guilty. "Well, Ida, you certainly settled in nicely," grumbled Grandma Agatha. "It's easy to blame Antonio without consequences, especially since you regularly receive money from him and he left you the apartment." "You know, Mom, that's the least he could do," Ida declared with a strained voice. "By the way, he ruined my life." "Yes, both of you are cripples," Grandma said bitterly, waving her hand hopelessly. Their father appeared in their apartment occasionally, each time overcoming considerable difficulties such as sudden date changes for visits, last-minute bans from coming due to illnesses, urgent matters, or simply his mother's bad mood. It seemed he was exhausting all his energy negotiating with his own mother because, when he did manage to reach his daughter, he sat before her empty and lost, not knowing what to say. Maria also felt uncomfortable in her father's presence. He seemed like a strange and frightening person to her. Antonio smiled apologetically, handed a gift to their daughter, and left. Ida forbade them from going out together. There was no talk of taking the girl, for example, on a day off. After their father left, their mother was sick for a long time and made it obvious. She tied her head with a damp towel and lay on the couch, making loud noises and not particularly choosing her words, expressing herself in the spirit of "all men are bastards." Maria felt very sorry for both her mother and herself. As Maria grew older, she naturally tried to understand what was true in their family and what wasn't. "Your father is a good man, he's kind and honest, although weak." "Forgive me, Lord," her grandmother Agatha told her. "It's just that if you hear for many years that well, in general, that you're wrong, sooner or later you start to believe it yourself." So Antonio came to believe that he's a bad father. Well, and since he's bad, there's nothing special he needs to do around you. Understand? Don't understand? Well, you'll grow up and understand. Antonio continued to pay money even after Maria turned 18. He paid for the girl's tutors, which were needed for her preparation to enter university, a dress for the graduation evening, and expenses for the banquet. But his sins in Ida's eyes, and thus in Maria's eyes, were too great for such nonsense to compensate for them. There was another crime on the father's record, much more serious than all the others. Such a thing can't be fixed with money, at least not with the ones he diligently transferred to his ex-wife's account. Maria was not a beauty, rather, she was quite pretty for a little girl, but as she grew up, she couldn't help but see her obvious flaws. Her nose was overtly too long, and her entire face seemed stretched, which even earned the girl the nickname Cucumber. Her not very healthy skin from around the age of 14 drove her little owner to despair, with inflammations arising here and there, and once a month, a huge, glowing red pimple on her chin. Her hair, light and thin, absolutely refused to lie beautifully on her shoulders, and within half a day turned into icicles that seemed not to have been washed for a month. Her excellent, slim, and shapely figure, large beautiful eyes of rare green color, and a white-toothed smile did not console Maria at all. In the girl's opinion, compared to her appearance flaws, her merits were few. "Be thankful for your so-called father," Ida said in response to her daughter's complaints. "He's the one who gifted you with his lousy genes. Just look at me, see? Perfect skin. And it's always been like that. And my hair is normal. And everything you have, it's from him, from your dear daddy. After such words of support, the girl swallowed her tears, covered her pimples with unpleasant-smelling ointment, and thought that if it weren't for the necessity to go to school and additional classes, she wouldn't leave the house at all, so as not to hear biting comments about herself and not to see mocking glances from her peers. However, there was one person who, it seemed, didn't care how Maria looked. It was a neighbor in their entrance and a classmate named Fidel. From birth, the boy and girl, living in the same entrance, were acquainted. At first, they spent the required time in the same sandbox, taking each other's scoops and molds. Then, as they grew up, their interests began to diverge in different directions. Fidel was sent to hockey at the age of 4, and he, horrifically serious, completely stopped noticing the neighbor girl, except that on a convenient occasion he couldn't resist and would tug her thin braid, as if it were made for that. Receiving a well-deserved "you fool" in response, he considered the contact established and benignly nodded to Maria. At school, they ended up in the same class. And in 7th grade, after the summer holidays, the boys came to school completely different from how they were 3 months ago. Everyone suddenly grew taller, matured significantly, and noticed it themselves. Maria also changed, and as she believed, not for the better. Her arms suddenly became long and somewhat awkward, sticking out in all directions. But the biggest problem was her nose, which protruded on her face like some kind of mushroom. And, of course, there were jokers in the class who didn't hesitate to point it out. "Oh, Maria, you've grown yourself quite a nose," exclaimed one of the class clowns to the entire class. "Well, you're just like Pinocchio, Maria Pinocchio." The boy shook with laughter, inviting everyone around to share in the fun, and feeling the approval of his classmates, he continued joking. Heron, let me hold your nose." "Do you want to have the same one now?" a calm, quiet voice suddenly spoke up. "You'll hold your own, no need to ask anyone." Everyone involuntarily looked around and fell silent. At the back of the desk sat a boy, serious, focused, broad-shouldered. There was no fooling around with Fidel Gomez. The boy had been playing hockey for 10 years, could effortlessly do 50 pull-ups on a bar and break bricks with his fist calmly, without frowning. Everyone knew he could knock out any part of someone's body and tie it into a knot on their back. The person who offended Maria thought, and, evidently deciding that she wasn't worth the risk, left the final word to Fidel. "Thank you," Maria mumbled as she approached Fidel. "You know, your thanks mean a lot to me," the boy replied kindly. "And if you really want to show your gratitude, well, you heard me today, right? The history teacher gave me a report to do on some medieval princes. I don't have time to deal with nonsense. I have an important training session today, you know?" He looked expectantly at the girl and raised his eyebrows, almost forming a question mark on his face. "Oh," she realized, "you want me to write the report for you?" He sighed with relief and nodded, clearly pleased with her quick thinking. Thus began a long-standing, productive collaboration. At school, it was clearly explained to all concerned that Maria Moyo was under the personal supervision of Fidel Gomez, and the young hockey player's homework became much better and more substantial from that moment on. Fidel and Maria grew up, matured, and somehow gradually became good and often indispensable friends to each other. Maria helped Fidel with his studies and, as he himself admitted, saved him from being kicked out of the team and from his parents' anger more than once. Fidel's role in her life, apart from protection, was quite strange overall. He became an involuntary source of information about relationships between people. It turned out that, contrary to Maria's mother's opinion, there are many good, decent men. For example, Fidel himself, strong, kind, sometimes sly, ironic, but reliable and faithful. And their conversations sometimes went in such directions that the girl pondered them deeply. "Why are you so shy?" he asked once after another of her complaints about her appearance. "Come on, pimples, everyone has them. Look, see what a nasty pimple I've got here. More of yours. So what? You have it now, you won't tomorrow. You're a pretty girl, just stupid, insecure, and hunchbacked. Cut your hair, straighten up, don't care about anything, and look happier. A nose like yours should be worn proudly, like a banner. What are you talking about? Maria was astonished. What banner? Remember, you have great eyes and a smile. And what's between them isn't that important. Listen, I don't understand, Fidel asked the next time, not being particularly mannerly. Where is your dad? Dad, the girl was surprised. I mean, father? I don't like that word, the boy said confidently. It's somewhat rude, cold. He's somewhere, I don't know. For some reason, Maria suddenly felt ashamed, though she wasn't really at fault. So, how do you even talk to him? The boy continued his interrogation. Listen, why are you pestering me about your father? Maria got angry, more from not knowing what to say. Well, actually with your father, the boy smirked. I see, you don't talk to him, huh? A shame. Well, okay. Fidel ended the conversation, and Maria continued it in her mind. It turned out that she was somehow at fault with a family member whom she had, willingly or under her mother's influence, thrown out of her life. Grandmother Agatha, already very old, also periodically added her arguments to this topic. You still don't see your father? She asked grumpily. Well, look, I'm going to die soon, and you still have another grandmother somewhere in the world. Grandma, why do you keep blaming me for him? The girl protested. If we are this way, then why doesn't he, father, come or call himself? Come on, answer me. Can't you? Well, I'll tell you, because I'm not needed by him. So why should I run after him? You'll say I'm wrong? Maybe you're right, sighed the old lady. And Antonio is probably right in his own way. But together, both are wrong. She saw her grandmother rarely, and Fidel she saw almost every day, and somehow he became her main confidant and advisor. Even regarding the dress for the school prom, Maria rushed to consult Fidel. Grandmother Agatha just shook her head, though not particularly surprised. Well, Grandma, the girl muttered shyly. Well, he is still a man, after all, who else but him can appreciate it? Well, sure, Grandma nodded. But, Fidel, a real man, not just any man. You should understand that yourself. That green one, of course, Fidel confidently declared, looking at the options offered to him for evaluation. Your eyes in it are just like green lanterns, just remove that stupid flower, it's not needed here. And don't hunch over, how many times do I have to tell you? Having disregarded the dubious compliment about her lantern-like eyes, Maria followed all of Fidel's other recommendations without fail. She removed the flower, lifted her nose, straightened her back, and trimmed her hair. And she looked exceptionally beautiful. It was a genuine first success. She was looked at in surprise even by those who thought that Moya, with his barrier-like nose, could neither generate interest nor pose competition. At the graduation party, Fidel kept a close eye to ensure that no one mistreated his best friend as they said goodbye. Besides, Maria herself was no longer the same as before. She was much more confident. Listen, Moya, you. Maria, in general, forgive me, okay? Well, you were a fool, what? A longtime enemy of the girl was squirming and blushing nearby. The inventor of the offensive nicknames Pinocchio and Heron, with whom she had studied for many years. Come on, forget it, she forgave the offender generously. And she didn't see how Fidel Gomez, who was watching them carefully, nodded his head approvingly. The kids finished school and went their separate ways. Fidel, having quit hockey, entered some technical university, and Maria went to law school. Studying at university came quite easily to Maria. Of course, she still had a long way to go before becoming a beauty of the first course, but she was no longer the insecure girl who always suffered from her flaws. The long-ago words of Fidel about holding her nose proudly, like a banner, always amused her and helped her many times in difficult moments. Maria had no shortage of friends. She lived a cheerful student life with constant parties, gatherings, and hangouts. After one such rather lively party, Maria was preparing to go home late in the evening. One of the guys, however, who was not part of their student fraternity and had ended up at the event by chance, simply by coming with someone, took it upon himself to escort her home. The guy named Vasco was quite attractive, excellently built, tall, blonde, with squinting gray eyes and dark glasses on his nose, which he didn't take off even in the evening. He was very stylishly dressed and somehow made a special impression. Actually, he looked somewhat like DiCaprio, whispered one of her classmates to her. Maria, having recently watched the famous Titanic, nodded in agreement. Vasco did indeed resemble a romantic hero in some way. The party was winding down, and Maria was getting ready to go home. And then the guy, who in her mind was already firmly linked with the handsome Leo, suddenly approached her himself. "Are you going home? Maria, can I escort you?" She heard a hoarse voice and felt her ears and cheeks flush with excitement, and her heart began to beat unusually fast. "I just noticed that you're alone, without a boyfriend. It's even strange, such a pretty girl without someone to walk you home," Vasco added, smiling. "How wonderful it will be to walk alongside this handsome guy. Surely he will offer her his hand, or maybe just take her palm in his," Maria thought involuntarily, enchanted as she gazed into his gray eyes. "I should casually suggest to him to go for a walk, maybe they'll talk, and all of this will have some beautiful continuation. After all, almost all the girls in their third year are already dating guys. 2 of them have even almost gotten married, but she remained inexperienced. She hasn't even had a proper kiss yet. Tell someone, they wouldn't believe it." However, Vasco immediately ruined everything by saying, "I have a friend with a car here, and he'll give us a ride, so you'll get home quickly." "Well, shall we go?" Maria sighed in disappointment. So, a romantic walk under the moonlight won't happen. She had almost decided to decline the escort, but after looking at Vasco, who was smiling and extending his hand to her, she nodded. They got into the back seat of a dark foreign car. Vasco exchanged looks with his friend who was driving, and the car rolled through the evening streets. Before reaching the house where Maria lived, the car stopped and parked by the sidewalk. "Well, thank you very much, Vasco, for seeing me off and giving me a ride. And thank you to you as well," she addressed the car's driver. "Thank you." "That's, of course, a bit too little," Vasco suddenly said, holding the girl by the hand as she was about to get out of the car. "Listen, Maria, Leo and I came up with a brilliant idea on the way. After all, it's still pretty early. Let's continue the party, shall we? See, Leo's apartment is available. We have excellent music records, something to drink, and everything. Shall we go? And you can say your thanks there." "Yeah, maybe a few more times," Vasco's friend declared unpleasantly. "No, thank you, I'll pass on that." Maria straightened up and moved away from the guy, her trembling hand groping for the car door handle and not finding it. "Hey, why are you struggling?" The driver called over his shoulder. "Yeah, right, like I'm a star, and you should be lucky that decent men invited you, otherwise you'd still be wandering around." "It's nothing, I'll just look around." Maria finally found the damn door handle and, pulling it, tried to jump out of the car. But instead, she felt strong, firm hands pulling her back into the cabin. "Come on, don't struggle, you'll be fine, I promise." She heard a hurried whisper and felt something sticky and dense, possibly a bandage, being pressed onto her mouth. And then something strange happened. The car door swung open, and it was as if an unknown force dragged Maria out of the terrifying car onto the street. A human shadow flashed past her, the sound of a hit echoed, and then more, the ringing of breaking glass, a scream, then the slamming of the door and the screech you hear when a car suddenly starts moving. Maria seemed to fall into some kind of stupor and just stood in the middle of the sidewalk, without even removing the piece of adhesive plaster from her lips. "Why are you wandering around in the dark, dummy? And you even found yourself escorts, for God's sake," she heard familiar mutterings. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you? Come on, say something already. Can you hear me? Did you swallow your tongue from fear? Her hands were also very strong and sturdy, but now they gently and carefully shook her by the shoulders, smoothed her hair, and removed the unpleasant sticky tape from her lips. "Moya, listen." Fidel looked at her both sternly and tenderly at the same time. "Well, you're already a very big girl and still haven't learned that you shouldn't get into a car with strangers, especially not with drunk uncles. What if I hadn't happened to run to your mother right now, or hadn't noticed someone dragging you and shoving you into the car? Well, Maria, you can't be so foolish at your age." At that moment, Maria broke down. The entire horror of what could have happened to her if Fidel Gomez hadn't happened, as he put it by sheer chance, to rush into his childhood home, literally overwhelmed her. She trembled with her whole body, and tears kept streaming down her cheeks, landing on Fidel's shirt. All right, calm down, look at what you've done. I feel like I got caught in the rain. Enough, calm down." He, without stopping his muttering, wiped her face with his not-so-clean handkerchief and, like a little girl, held her nose, forcing her to blow it. Then they stood up and, swaying, walked to her familiar building. Maria wasn't afraid of excessive attention from her mother. Ida had recently completely stopped paying attention to her daughter, believing that she had grown up, and in her opinion, had become quite an ungrateful person who should solve all her problems on her own. The young men slipped into Maria's room. "All right, you need to drink something, wash up, and go to sleep," Fidel declared in a commanding tone. "And tomorrow we'll think about what to do with all this." "No need to do anything," Maria became frightened. "What do you mean? I don't even want to think about it." "Listen, we need to find and punish those jerks, you understand?" The guy protested. "For some reason, I think you already punished them well enough," Maria nodded. "Well, actually, yes. I gave a good thrashing to the one who was holding you. I don't think anyone will take an interest in him anytime soon. I didn't get to the second one. He started too quickly, but now he needs new car windows. But, it still needs to be done. Fidel, right now I only need one thing. Sit with me, okay?" When she woke up, the sun was shining brightly through the window. A pillow was tucked under her head, and her legs were covered with a soft blanket. Maria didn't know how long Fidel had sat next to her or when she had fallen asleep. She tried not to remember the previous day and its terrifying end, which had almost turned into an irreparable disaster for her. Time passed, and Maria graduated from college and secured a position as a consultant at a large firm. Her career quickly took off, and within a few years, she confidently led the legal department, was well regarded by the management, and received a very respectable salary. The money she earned allowed her to fairly quickly acquire a small but decent and, most importantly, her own home and car. And every time she needed advice or help, she didn't hesitate to turn to her, essentially, only true friend. Fidel organized renovations for her apartment, personally moved her furniture and belongings into the new home, and then didn't leave the inexperienced new resident to deal with her numerous problems. "What a joy, Moya, having to deal with you," he grumbled when she once again asked him to drill holes for new curtains or help move a wardrobe from one corner of the room to another. "You found yourself a husband for an hour. Well, at least feed me. Why does your oven smell so delicious? You, Moya, have become completely insolent." He mumbled again when she asked him to help her choose a car, and they spent several weekends in a row jostling among sellers and buyers at the auto market. "I have my own personal life, and instead of courting a beautiful woman, by the way, who isn't without prospects, I'm already spending several weekends on you. So, well, there's nothing decent today," he concluded his search. "Fidel, please forgive me, I understand you're too busy for me," she mumbled awkwardly. "Next time, I'll ask at work to have someone go with me. It seems we have one there." "What else?" Fidel snorted indignantly. "So I entrusted you to someone, and you'll definitely buy complete junk, leaving me to deal with you and your crap. That's it, I'll think about finding a car for you myself. Anyway, come on, I don't have time, I'm already late, I'm off." "Oh, Moya, now I'll be stuck because of you, I might end up living with you, keep that in mind." Fidel disappeared before she could shower him with thanks and apologies, which, in any case, were never particularly needed by either of them. "Fidel, I think I've fallen in love," she declared to her friend one day during a meeting. "Well, thank God, finally." Fidel flapped his hands humorously like an old lady and smiled broadly. "Am I finally going to get rid of you, my misery? You have no idea how happy I am to hand you and all your endless problems over to this unknown martyr. It's happened, thank God, Lord, I'm free." He rolled his eyes humorously, as if in a silent prayer. By that time, he was already married, although he divorced quickly, jokingly blaming Maria for ruining his married life by endlessly distracting him with her problems. Being a rather reserved person, Fidel didn't share much about his life, not even with his best friend. And Maria, to be honest, didn't ask much either. She was greatly captivated by such unexpected and vivid events in her own, admittedly quite dull and monotonous life. She met Thomas at the office, or rather, in her own office. And this acquaintance didn't bode well for anything. It was a very hot summer. The huge panoramic windows installed in the office center where Maria's firm was located had always been their pride. Through them opened stunning views of the city, the river, and the surrounding areas. The offices and meeting rooms were always bright and spacious. But now, the room's pride had turned into a huge disadvantage. Through the glass walls, the office was almost constantly overheating to the point that it seemed like soon everything inside would start melting and dripping onto the floor. To make matters worse, the air conditioning system in the building broke down, and working became, well, simply impossible. "Maria, the technicians have already been called. They promised to be here after lunch," the secretary girl mumbled, watching as the head of the legal department fanned himself with a paper fan, his face showing signs of suffering. At the appointed time, the long-awaited technicians arrived. They leisurely walked around the room, inspected the air conditioners, engaged in painfully long conversations for the office residents, and finally spread out into the offices. Maria was assigned a short, sturdy, dark-haired man with glasses. "I'll be the one to remove it," he grumbled at the air conditioner hanging by the window. He casually approached the window. "Maybe a bit faster?" Maria asked irritably. "It's impossible to work or breathe." "Well, have some water," the technician muttered. The unbearable heat, stuffy and stale air, a blouse stuck to her sweaty back, and the familiar premonition of a pimple about to erupt on her chin tormented Maria. Moreover, an important contract she was supposed to present to the director in a couple of hours was going completely wrong. And the man's response, which was actually quite harmless, triggered a reaction in Maria that was far from her usual restrained and polite demeanor. "What do you think you're doing? Are you completely out of your mind? I don't know what I'll do with you." "It wasn't enough for me to have a technician giving me advice," Maria erupted indignantly. "I only gave a small piece of advice," the man calmly responded, not reacting at all to her hysteria, "and by the way, he wasn't the dumbest person." Maria gasped, snorted, and rushed out of the office. When she returned, the air conditioner was quietly humming in the corner under the ceiling, sending waves of cool air her way. She sat in the chair and blissfully closed her eyes. And then, the recent stifling heat was replaced by another kind of heat. The heat of shame. What a horror! She had yelled at an innocent person who was just doing his job. She screamed like a street vendor. What a disgrace, she hoped no one heard it. At least she would never see that person again. But she saw him literally the next day. To her great astonishment, Maria found him in the parking lot by her car, where he patiently waited for her at the end of the workday. However, Maria didn't recognize him right away. In her office, he was wearing a work jumpsuit and a baseball cap on his head. Besides, she had neither the time nor the desire to take a good look at him then. The only thing she remembered was that the technician was clearly unshaven, which had only increased her irritation at the time. Now, in the parking lot, he seemed like a completely different person. Despite the heat, he was wearing a well-fitted classic suit and a light shirt. And for some reason, it seemed, no, It was evident that in this dark and heavy clothing, he still looked fresh and energetic. A clean-shaven face and meticulously groomed dark hair, along with light glasses and a thin frame, completed his appearance. But the most striking thing was that he was holding a luxurious bouquet of dark burgundy roses in his hands. Throughout her adult life, Maria had received flowers more than once. Friends, colleagues, and superiors had gifted her bouquets on various occasions and holidays. Fidel diligently brought her a bunch of her favorite colorful chrysanthemums every year on her birthday. A couple of times, she received utterly unbearable large and expensive flower baskets to celebrate the company's successful deals. But all those flowers were something entirely different. They lacked the most important element, a serious and interested male gaze accompanying the bouquet. But now, his gaze was very serious and very interested. Maria. His voice sounded completely different too, solid, calm, and very pleasant. Maria, excuse me for approaching you like this on the street, but I just thought that I don't have any other chance to get to know you. I decided to take the simplest route. Here. These are flowers for you, and my name is Thomas. Oh, thank you, so unexpected and strange, she managed to say. I behaved so badly yesterday, it's just embarrassing to think about it. Well, I understand that yesterday in the office you were not yourself. He smiled warmly all of a sudden. A woman exhausted by the heat and worries. I would very much like to invite you to a wonderful place nearby. By the way, he added with a serious expression, the air conditioner there is in perfect working order, I've checked. Their relationship developed incredibly quickly, yet it remained surprisingly calm. Thomas consistently courted Maria, called her every day, picked her up from work, gave her flowers, took her to restaurants, spoke the right and beautiful words, kissed her hand goodbye, but he didn't resemble the passionate man Maria had imagined. Of course, her experience with romantic relationships was negligible, practically non-existent. Yet Thomas's restraint and seriousness in their relationship sometimes puzzled her. Maria, I'm an adult man, explained Thomas, who was 10 years older than her. And, to be honest, there's not much romance in me at all. I love you, believe me, and I want you to marry me. Maybe I should say all this differently, with a different face and a different tone, but forgive me, as best as I can. Well, I'm not a romantic. Fidel, what should I do? She rushed to her old advisor and confidant. Oh, come on, Moya, Fidel smirked. How should I know what you should do? Do you love him? I love him, Maria nodded confidently. Of course I love him, what else is there to say? For the first time in my life, I've finally met a real man. Fidel jerked strangely and looked at his friend attentively. If you're sure you love him, then marry him, that's all you need to figure out, Fidel mumbled and added a phrase that, preoccupied with his own worries and feelings, Maria simply didn't hear. And maybe I'll feel better and calmer. Maria gave Thomas her consent, and the wedding day was set. Did you invite your father to the wedding? Fidel suddenly asked in the midst of the wedding preparations. For what reason? Maria was surprised. I saw him for the last time about 5 years ago, probably. No, 6 years ago. Well, let's say that characterizes you as not the smartest woman, Fidel snorted. Listen, Moya, have some conscience. You have such an event ahead of you. If this guy, Thomas, turns out to be patient enough and can put up with you, maybe it will be the only such event in your life. And you want to tarnish your wedding by not inviting your own father? Fidel shrugged. Do you still hold a grudge against him, even after all these years? So, you, Maria Moya, are sillier, more insecure, and more ungrateful than I thought. What a pity. Frankly, Maria was then offended with Fidel. What is he saying? Why should she invite to her celebration someone who is completely a stranger to her, essentially a person she barely knows, and surely have to face her mother's offended face? Oh, but that is indeed a huge problem, also threatening a possible scandal. No, she would never turn the most important day of her life into a farce for anything. And yet, Fidel's words stuck like a nail in her head. A few days before the wedding, scolding herself for being a weak-willed idiot, she dialed a number she had never called before. Strangely enough, it was as if he was waiting for her call, although that was, of course, entirely impossible. It seemed that the first call signal had not yet ceased, and a muffled, male, almost forgotten voice sounded through the receiver. "Yes, hello, Maria, is that you?" In his voice, there suddenly sounded such hope and at the same time such fear of making a mistake that she felt uneasy. "Yes, it's me, hello." She still couldn't bring herself to say the simple and light word Dad, and she didn't want to utter the dry, cold word her father had once used, as Fidel had mentioned. "I'm so glad you called. I've wanted to see you for so long. Or at least hear your voice. You won't believe it, but I was thinking about you today. Actually, I think about you every day. And then you suddenly call." In the receiver, it was clear that Antonio was hurrying, rushing, as if he was afraid that she would hang up the conversation at any moment and he wouldn't have time to tell her everything he wanted. Yes, of course, listen, I wanted to tell you. So, here's the thing. I'm getting married." She interrupted, cursing Fidel for his silly ideas and her own equally foolish compliance. "I wonder how she will manage if this so-called close relative now demands an invitation to the celebration." "Getting married? Oh, how wonderful. I'm so happy for you, so happy." "I know, I'm sure you'll be happy." His voice somehow cracked suspiciously, but after a few seconds, his voice sounded normal again. "Maria, my dear, I'm so grateful that you simply called and told me about it. And, of course, I'll be very happy to congratulate you." It started, she thought sadly, imagining her mother's face when he appeared at the celebration. "But, darling, of course, I understand that my appearance at your wedding would be inappropriate, perhaps? And it would make you uncomfortable, I understand everything." "Well, why?" Maria interjected involuntarily, astonished. "No, of course, I shouldn't appear at the wedding, but I would still like, if possible, to congratulate you somehow, to see you, the bride in your wedding dress." He fell silent, but it was a peculiar ringing silence, as if he was trying with all his might to hold back words and emotions bursting from him. "Well, all right, I'll think about it and call you. And we'll definitely meet somewhere," she said, and suddenly felt as if something had clenched her throat for some reason and her eyes itched. She met her father on her wedding day at a prearranged spot on the way to the restaurant. She was waiting and feared this meeting because it was unknown how he looked now, how he would behave, and what impression all this would make on Thomas. What if, right now, she gets out of the car and a trembling homeless man joyfully rushes into her arms, suggesting to celebrate the event right there on the spot by passing around a bottle? What a surprise meeting with the bride's father! Maria, leaning on her newlywed husband's arm, got out of the car and smoothed the folds of her voluminous skirt. "Hello, darling," came a soft muffled voice. She stared in amazement at the approaching man holding a stunning bouquet of delicate cream-colored roses in his hands. She was prepared for anything, that her father might have aged significantly over the years, perhaps sagged. For some reason, she imagined the worst, but the man, hesitantly standing a few steps away from her, had nothing to do with those fantasies. Lean and fit, with a youthful face, delicate graying hair, handsome and stylishly dressed, he looked at her timidly, confusedly, and admiringly. "Dear Maria," he said hoarsely, "I congratulate you, both of you, and thank you." He handed her the flowers and a thick, plump envelope. She approached and felt a light warm kiss on her cheek. Obviously, only the fear of hopelessly ruining her complex festive makeup helped Maria restrain herself and not shed a tear. Having become a married lady, Maria was initially completely happy. Her life was correct, beautiful, and sophisticated, as a family life of two educated and cultured people should be. They traveled through Europe, furnished Maria's apartment anew, changed their car, and she suddenly realized that she had nothing more to do with Thomas and nothing to talk about. Apparently, he was absolutely satisfied with everything. "I don't quite understand what you're lacking," he said. Right now, we're both full of energy and can work for a few more years, saving money, then we'll build a house and can think about children. A house. It was Maria's long-held and passionate dream. A large, spacious, and bright home, definitely with huge floor-to-ceiling windows, a wide polished staircase, an entire wall of books, and a terrace overlooking a lawn. Yes, in Maria's opinion, it was worth working for and pretending that everything was fine just for this. As it turned out later, all of Thomas's plans and calculations were based primarily on his wife's earnings and prospects. For a couple of years, everything was as it should be. Maria climbed the career ladder, earned more than enough, and, apparently, fully lived up to the expectations placed on her. But then everything collapsed. The holding company where Maria had worked almost since graduating from college went bankrupt. The high position she held in the bankrupt firm played a cruel trick on her. For a while, other companies were simply afraid to hire her. Who would entrust their legal matters to a specialist who had just emerged from the wreckage of a collapsed company? Thomas began to disappear in the evenings, started hiding his mobile phone, and finally spoke up with his characteristic bluntness. "Maria, we are both grown-up and intelligent people. You understand that we no longer have any prospects together. So let's just calmly and peacefully part ways, all right? Listen, did you ever love me at all?" She asked him as they parted. "I loved you." He seemed to blush for the first time during all the time she had known him. "Yes, of course. Probably. I don't know. Anyway, you know." Yes, I remember. "You're not a romantic." Maria smiled sadly, putting an end to her married life. A year after their divorce, a call came from her father. No, it was no longer unexpected. On the contrary, it was welcome and ordinary. Since the wedding day, initially occasionally, often by chance, and then more and more frequently, she began to communicate with her father, returning calls and meeting up. Perhaps she didn't even notice how these calls and meetings became necessary and important to her. They seemed to finally close the ugly, torn hole in her life, from which coldness and resentment always blew. Maria. Her father, walking beside her along the park's path, was just as usual, calm, restrained, and elegant. "I need to tell you something. Let's sit down here." He lightly touched her sleeve and nodded toward a bench. As they sat down, she suddenly felt as if he had slightly gasped for breath. "You see, darling." He paused and looked at her with calm, warm eyes. "I'm not entirely healthy. Or rather, how should I put it? I'm completely unwell. Basically, I don't have much time left. According to my attending doctor, maybe 3 or 4 months. No, Maria, please don't look at me with such horror." He raised his hands pleadingly. "I scared you, I understand, but I still didn't figure out how to say it. So I decided to just say it like this, simple and straightforward." "Dad," she whispered, finally uttering such a simple and warm word, "how could this be?" "Now, I'm not even afraid to go," Antonio smiled. He died 4 months later as promised by the doctor, peacefully and calmly, smiling and holding his daughter's hand. It later turned out that the years since Ida had shut the door behind him were not in vain. Antonio proved to be quite a wealthy man, and having no one else in the world besides Maria, he, of course, left everything to his daughter. After burying her father, she sat at the table in shock and looked fearfully at the man walking in front of her. "You're so annoying me, Moya," Fidel Gomez said angrily. "All your life I've had no peace from you. Now you've inherited some money, so be happy. Why are you getting so worked up, and what do you need from me?" "Well, Fidel, I don't know what to do, how to live, and this money, you know, I probably don't deserve this money," she mumbled. "Well, donate it to the Amor Tiger Protection Fund, or give it to the poor, or build a monument for your father out of expensive stone. Just get away from me, you've drained my soul." Fidel suddenly hid his face in his palms, collapsed onto the chair, and fell silent. "Fidel, what's wrong?" Maria became frightened. And suddenly her heart started pounding fast. The realization that she had no one closer and dearer to her than the shaggy, broad-shouldered man with big hands sitting in front of her suddenly overwhelmed her. But with a weight that was amazingly joyful and desirable. Fidel. She sat in front of him and lightly touched his temples and simply touched his painfully familiar face and was struck by a feeling that literally pierced her from head to toe. He grabbed her hands and pressed them to his eyes. "You, Moya, are a stupid, insecure, still somewhat hunchbacked woman," she heard. "But now you're also rich, and surely, due to your own foolishness, you'll buy a house with ridiculous huge windows that no one knows who should clean, with a lawn that will need mowing from morning till night. But what can you do? You've never used your head." She tried to pull her hands away from his face and look into Fidel's eyes. He was an old athlete, and doing something against his will was not so easy. And it seemed he wasn't planning to let go of her hands anymore. "And if you used your brains even occasionally, you'd have long understood that I love you, I've always loved you, and I'm ready to mow all these damn lawns for you even until the end of my life."
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.